Hey y'all, who dat and welcome in. I am Jeff Nowak and this is Inside Black and Gold. We are coming at you with a special 53-man roster edition of the podcast. I say we, it's just me solo. Steve Geller's getting the night off. Actually, he just hosted a show on WWL radio, so we're giving him a pass on this one. But I did want to come on here and break down the roster and kind of some quick takeaways on what we saw. It was a busy day. There was some surprises, not a ton of surprises, but some notable surprises. So we're going to get into that in the second half of the program. We're going to do a mailbag. So if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, make sure to get your comments or questions in the feed, and we'll corral them all and get to as many as possible in the second half of this program. But first things first, let's hear from the myth, the man himself. It's Blake Groupie.
Yeah, I mean, every single day I know I had to bring it. The guy's been here and he's done it. So to see a guy that's done it like that, you pick up on things. You know that you every single day you have to go out and do it because you know dang well that he is. And so it's a guy that's done it, and I couldn't ask for a better competition and a better guy to do it against.
That was Blake Groupie. No, he is not a 17-year-old. He is the Saints' new place kicker. Technical problems. And, good for him. We watched him throughout camp, and I feel like I don't think he could have done better, right? Like you look at a guy and you say, okay, how can he take advantage of his opportunities? He did that. I mean, he barely missed any kicks. The only kick he missed in the preseason games was a 60-yarder, which, I've seen Lutz hit a 60-yarder once, but anytime you're getting that chance in a game, Will Lutz's first career game, he got a chance at a 60-plus yarder against the Raiders, and he missed. And the Saints didn't hold it against him. So they didn't hold it against Groupie either. And if you listen to this podcast, you've heard me say this over the last few weeks. The trade that made the most sense to me was Will Lutz to the Broncos, where he could rejoin Sean Payton. Sean gets a guy that he knows, and the Saints stick with Blake Groupie. And the real question was, how confident are you really in Blake Groupie? Because if you are, then you can put your money where your mouth is and just keep the young guy. And that's what happened. The Saints sent Will Lutz to the Broncos for a 7th-round pick. And we're gonna see what we get. Now, that wasn't the only specialist move of the day, because you also had, as I scroll down this list, you also had the Aussie himself, Lou Hedley, all 6'2", 220 pounds of him. I think he might be 6'4", actually. 30 years old, beats out Blake Gillikin. He's a 30-year-old rookie. The irony being, Blake Gillikin's only 25. Blake Gillikin is significantly younger than the unproven rookie punter that you're keeping around. And, this one surprised me, even though I was probably on the early side of saying, no, this is a real punter battle. We have to see what happens. But I hadn't seen anything significant to give Hedley the edge there, other than, the money makes sense. And, we'll see what happens. I don't think that Blake Gillikin was ever really endeared to this coaching staff. And when you look at some of these moves, I think one of the things that stands out is this is Dennis Allen's team now, and he is making sure that he's able to put his stamp on this team and own it, right? If he goes down in flames, he's going to go down in flames with his staff, with the players that he likes, right? With his decisions. And last year, I don't think you ever got that. Last year, I think what you ended up seeing way too much of was the Saints trying to extend the Sean Payton era rather than allow Dennis Allen to create something that he fit, that he felt comfortable in, and go from there. Does it work? Now, that's another question entirely. But you have to appreciate the process a lot more than, if Dennis Allen's tenure was just to be a Sean Payton also ran for 2 years, hard to respect that. At least this one, if you go down in flames with the quarterback you want, with your defensive coordinator, with the specialists you chose, right? With the draft picks that you engineered, then at least you can say you gave it the try it deserved, right? So, and I think that's kind of where you're at, because I have seen a more confident Dennis Allen this offseason. And here he is talking about the decisions on both specialists.
Tough, real tough. Willett's been a good kicker for us for a while now, and so that was obviously a tough decision. Look, we felt like we had a chance to get value for a player, and we felt like we had another guy in the building that we had confidence in. So those are always challenging situations.
With both of the undrafted rookie kicker and punter, was it just that they exceeded expectations and like almost made it sort of an undeniable type of choice?
Well, look, I don't know if it was undeniable. I mean, it's a tough situation to be in, but yet it's a good situation because we felt like, of those four, we had four guys that are NFL caliber players, and so, we decided to go with the young guys.
Does being younger, cost-effective, longer contracts, does that?
Look, there's a lot of things that go into, roster decisions, and so, we basically took everything into account when we made these decisions.
What about Blake's makeup makes you feel like he's the guy?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily about the makeup. Certainly I think he's a confident young man, but I think it's really just about the fact that he's gone out and performed well. And look, every player at some point has been his first opportunity, and so I don't think we're unique in that situation.
See if I can get this right. I need to get better at that. But yeah, so one of the things that stood out to me there was, I think the factor in this that no one's talking about was Sean Payton only willing to trade for Will Lutz? And to me, I think that might be what you're, if there's a tiebreaker here and you can get a 7th round pick for a guy and you can just cut the other guy, then, I think it does make sense to get something rather than nothing. And I have a feeling that was a factor. I don't think it was the only factor. I think Blake did kick well enough to win that job. I think Will kicked well enough to win that job. But I also think when we talked to Will after Sunday's game, I mean, you could tell just by his mannerisms, he just seemed, I don't know, deflated. Like it felt like he knew at that point that he was not going to be the kicker here. So either way, you're setting up a situation where, put up or shut up. These guys are going to get their chance. Don't blow it, right? And if you end up in a situation where, think 2 years ago when you didn't have Will and you were cutting kickers left and right, you could not find a kicker to save your life. You couldn't make a point after to save your life. If you end up there again because you cut Will, because you cut a guy who was reasonably consistent, although he was struggling last year, man, this move is going to get scrutinized to no end. The punter, I think it's really tough to gauge the differences between a really good punter and a really average punter. And so even if Lou doesn't go to the expectations you probably have for him, you can live with it. But the Blake Groupie, yeah, I mean, he's got another BG on the roster, and he's going to have to show up. Now, let's change gears here and go to the other position on this roster where there was kind of a bombshell move, and that's defensive back. Now, I've put out a handful of these roster projections, and I feel like I nailed the defensive back room pretty well. The only player that I did not have correct was Bradley Roby, which no one had correct because no one saw this coming this morning when the Saints just cut Bradley Roby. They were not able to get an asset for him. I'm guessing it was because of the contract he was on. Why would you pay somebody on a kind of a weird contract when you know you can sign him for the vet minimum anyway? He's going to be there if he wants to be there, right? You're trading for a guy you don't know what his demeanor is going to be when he shows up. It's harder than it sounds to pull off that kind of trade. You only see, a dozen of them every year where it's like, okay, I'd rather have something than nothing. And it just didn't work out. And so they cut Bradley Roby. And so to me, that means a couple things. One, it means that your boy Alontae Taylor is going to be the guy in the slot. He's going to have to be. And I didn't expect that. I expected them to go with Roby, but I think that there's this point you have to get to where Alante's got to play. He's too good to not play. How can you get him on the field? That's how. And were you going to bench Bradley Roby to get him on the field? I don't think that would work either. So you go move on from Bradley and you keep, which I think this is the other factor, and a guy I've talked about a good bit, you keep Isaac Yadam on the roster, a guy who is going to contribute big time on special teams and has played very well in the defense right throughout the preseason. He has had at least one interception. He had an interception against the Chargers. He's made a couple good plays. Like, he's a guy who fits. Whereas if you have to put somebody on the bench and not give them regular snaps, Bradley Roby doesn't fit. So I think that's where you're at. Now, would you have liked to see this done sooner? Yes, I would have. I would have much rather seen. That's why it kind of doesn't make a ton of sense, because if you were going to do this, then you would have wanted to be getting Alante Taylor first team reps, or Ugo Amadi first team reps, another guy who I think is going to factor in the slot. You didn't, and now you have to kind of just go with it, because I don't think Alante has looked that good in the slot. That said, we talked to him today, and he said one of the things that's helpful about this now is he's able to just drop the competition, which he already told us previously he wasn't too locked in terms of, he was just working on getting better. He wasn't going to spend too much time, in too much mind space on, what's this competition? How am I stacking up with the competition? The competition was the competition. But now he's able to just focus entirely on the slot. And I think you put him anywhere on the field, he will be good there eventually. He's got to learn. And that's the only gripe I have about this is, if you were going to move on from Bradley, you should have done it way earlier. The rest of the DB room, I'm in love with. I have no issues with any other decision. Like I said, the other 9 guys, other than Isaac Yadam, I had on here in my projection. Obviously, Marshawn, Paulson, Alante, and then Ugo Amadi and Lonnie Johnson. I have had them on the roster since day one. Both have been very good in what they've been asked to do. Ugo, I think he might be your backup returner. I talked to him about it today, and he said something along the lines of, I'm sitting on G waiting for the O. I don't know. It was weird. But, he's a guy who has returned before. He's been doing it for a while, and I expect if you do need someone in that role, he might be the first one off the bench to field a punt. Jordan Howden I talked to today as well, and, he's dedicated to special teams, and he showed up on special teams in the preseason finale. And I think, if you had any questions about what his role was going to be, there you go. The next question is going to be, if Marcus May gets suspended, who is that safety that steps in? Jordan's learned both spots. I think it would probably be Jordan alongside Tyron. And, he's going to take his lumps as a rookie in that position if he has to be in it. But, I don't see an alternative unless it's JT Gray, which, he's going to take his lumps too. As much as I love JT Gray for what he is not the guy you want starting at safety. Now, going down the line, Anthony Johnson is the guy I expect to see on special teams. I'm bummed he couldn't make it onto the roster, but it's a deep roster. You had to cut Bradley Roby. That's how deep it is. Smoke Monday, Jonathan Abram, Troy Pride Jr., Adrian Fry. These are all guys that I don't think had a ton of upside in terms of making this roster. None of them really showed what you needed them to show to carve out a spot. Smoke, as much as I like Smoke, he just didn't show up enough. I expect him to be on the practice squad. It's important to remember he's basically a rookie. So, they don't want to overreact to guys getting cut. I talked to DA about this today. It's like, when you're looking at a lot of these UDFAs, and obviously the 2 specialists made it, no other rookie UDFAs made the roster. There's a lot of them. There were a lot of them out there. Anthony Orji is a guy that I felt pretty good about. I had him on a couple of my projections, but I dropped him late. We can go into linebacker here in a second. And, one of the things you'll see is, okay, that first year is kind of a developmental year. You're figuring out where you are, and you're figuring out who has upside. And then that year 2 is where you have a chance to make the roster. You saw a guy, Nephi Sewell, make the roster. You saw Kirk Merritt make the roster as a running back. And so for a guy like Anthony Orji, for a guy like Shaq Davis, you're going to be kept around, I imagine, and you just have to continue to develop. And so, you say, wow, why'd they cut him? Well, it's all part of the process. You see, I have the linebackers up here. Now you only kept 5. And to me, that is an indicator, because I think you want 6, that you're going to stash somebody on IR and probably bring back a Jalen Smith. I was surprised they didn't keep Ryan Connolly on the roster to do that with him. He's dealing with a knee injury. You kind of go from there. But a guy like Landon Young, maybe a Traquan Smith, although I don't think his injury is that significant. And then a Kirk Merritt, maybe. But again, I don't think his injury is significant enough to merit just saying, okay, that was an accident. To merit a month that you're dedicated to not having them on the roster. But we'll see. Either way, I do feel slightly vindicated here because I was trying to tell people that Jalen Smith was not a lock to make this roster, and no one would believe me. No one would listen to me. It's the same way I told everyone early on that Paulson Adebo was going to win the outside cornerback battle, and no one would believe me. No one would listen to me, and here we are. Anyway, I digress. We can go through the defensive line. I don't think we even have to talk about it. It's exactly who you would have expected it to be. Nico Lalos is probably going to be on the practice squad. And maybe you can get him onto the roster if there are injuries later in the year. But otherwise, I feel really good about that position. This one surprised me. Offensive line, you did keep 9. One of them is Max Garcia. I expected the Saints to try to stash that center on the practice squad, just like Josh Andrews last year. They used the roster spot on it. I don't hate it because I don't love the idea of forcing Cesar Ruiz to be your backup center, which would be the case if you did not have one on the active roster. So I'm okay with that. What I will say is right now, you do not have a backup right tackle on the roster. And so, like I said with Jalen Smith, Storm Norton or TBA, right, to be determined, or player TBD is that guy. And he might be getting cut from another roster. I don't know. But you're going to have to sign somebody as a right tackle. And I think you're going to move Landon Young to IR and bring in somebody. Now, it might be Storm. It might be somebody else. Storm Norton has been getting the right tackle reps at the backup spot, so that's why I'd lean towards him. But it could be a number of people. Tight end, Lucas Krull is probably the only player that I look at and say, yeah, he has a very good chance of being snatched up on waivers. And it's not even about him developing beyond anything that we knew about already. It's just the fact that the Saints were in prime time the other night. They're on national television, and he had a 7-catch, 106-yard game. Anyone watching that game who was unaware of Lucas Krull is now aware of Lucas Krull. I still think it's not necessarily a high percentage that he gets claimed on waivers, because waiver claims are actually a lot more rare in these instances than you'd think. You think how difficult it is for the Saints to cut down to 53. Every team in the NFL is doing the same thing. They're all cutting down to 53. So, one of the reasons I don't expect a ton of waiver claims for the Saints is, okay, who else are you cutting? You already cut 37 guys. That was hard enough. You're going to cut more to take someone else, to take a player from someone else's roster that was not good enough to make it there. That's where I think people overestimate the likelihood of these waiver claims. But, one guy that I think caught everyone by surprise, and I think the reason is, he was hurt and everyone kind of lost track of him. But Kirk Merritt, he made this roster, and good for him, right? It's a guy who has changed positions, has worked incredibly hard, dealt with a hamstring injury in camp. He got another injury against the Chargers, but I think it's more precautionary. And why I say that is, if he was fighting for the roster, if he was in doubt, probably would have come back and played hurt. I think what happened is they felt good about it, and they kind of gave him the indication that, you're probably going to make it and you don't have to do that. And so just good for him. I mean, I don't know how long he's going to stay on the roster. I don't know what his role is going to be, but when you're a UDFA and you can make it onto the roster in year 2, look at Jawan Johnson. That's where you get your chance. And I know Dennis Allen is just a guy who loves positional versatility. And that makes a lot of sense to me, and you can go through all of the roster projections. You can go through mine. You can go through anyone who covers the Saints. I guarantee you they did not have Kirk Merritt on their final roster projection because, he kind of just fell off the radar. The last position I'll talk about here, wide receiver, nothing hugely surprising. This is basically how I had it set up. I did. I was the guy who all throughout camp was like, Traquan's going to make it. Traquan's going to make it. And then I got, I couldn't help myself. I saw the injury. He was out 3 weeks. I was like, maybe this is the final nail in the Traquan Smith coffin where you missed 3 weeks of camp and we can't justify keeping you on the roster. Can't do it. Well, I was wrong. They kept him on the roster. I don't know if they're going to stash him on IR. I don't know what the plan is, but either way, Traquan Smith is eternal, it seems. John Trey Kirkland, I thought for a second he might make this roster. He was one of the last cuts. I think he's going to be a special teams guy. I'm sorry. I think he's going to be a practice squad guy. And he'll go from there. Lynn Bowden Jr. is another guy I think had a decent chance to make this roster, and an injury might have done him in a little bit. And then Shaq Davis, I really like Shaq Davis. I think this roster really likes Shaq Davis, and they're going to get him on the practice squad and go from there. And hopefully next year he can continue to develop, or maybe later this year he can keep developing and do what Rashid Shaheed did last year. Like, everyone talks about Rashid Shaheed. They never talk about the fact that he got cut out of camp, right? He ended up on the practice squad. Now, they did a better job of hiding him in those last couple of preseason games, but it's not that unusual of a route to see a guy get cut, thrown on the practice squad, and then come back. Juwan Johnson, right? Like, he did the exact same thing, and you're going to go from there. But all in all, with the specialists notwithstanding, I think you saw a pretty ho-hum day of cuts. Bradley Roby got things started early, and I'm fascinated to see where Bradley ends up. I think he is still a high-quality corner in the NFL, and some team's going to end up with him, and some team's going to start him. And the Saints are going to have to, if that's a move that, while I can understand the logic behind it, if you end up in a situation like last year where you are without Marshawn Lattimore for a few games, you're without Paulson Adebo for a few games, and you end up starting guys who have no business starting, like you had to start Chris Harris last year, you're gonna be ruining that cut. And I'm sure Bradley will also Bradley will gladly revel in that, just like CJ did last year. But all right, let's wrap up that segment. We're going to come back and we're going to go into the mailbag. We're going to answer some viewer questions on the 53-man roster. This is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. You can follow me on Twitter at Jeff_Nowak. Follow the show at Saints_pod. Make sure you have subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating and a review, or wherever you get your podcasts, if they allow ratings. Do that. We appreciate it. Feedback's always helpful. And without further ado, let's hit the break and dive into that mailbag. And we're back here on Inside Black and Gold. I am Jeff Nowak. If you're watching on YouTube, and I'm kind of scrolling through this article over to my right, you can find it on WWL.com. I went through each position of the 53-man roster that was decided today and broke down, what my thoughts on each one, just like I did the roster projections previously. This is just about the actual, roster rather than my guesses as to what the roster will be. So I'll leave that up there and we'll go through it. But let's hit the mailbag on Inside Black and Gold. And the first things first, we got Randall. Randall's not a big fan of Dennis Allen, and he never has been. I don't think he ever will be. But I think he makes a good point. He says, let's not act like Dennis Allen cutting a proven kicker for a kid that's never kicked in the NFL and then trading him to Sean Payton was a genius move. He also says, what happens when the rookie can't kick it between the uprights? And I agree. Everything's a genius move when it works out, right? But what happens if Blake can't get it done, right? What happens if everything was a mirage and you get there and it's like he's like a deer in the headlights? We saw him make kicks in the preseason, but the regular season is a different animal. When you're on the road and 70,000 people are screaming at you and you're trying to make a 55-yarder to win a game, that is a completely different animal, and it's one that I know Lutz could handle. He had his warts. He missed some makeable kicks, but I always trusted him in those clutch moments. Even that kick in London, I for the life of me thought it was going in. I think everyone thought it was going in. It double doinked out from 61 yards. He was clean from 60. If you kicked another one from 60, it would have been good again. And that's what I'm worried about. And if it doesn't happen, if you end up in situations where the kicking game cost you games, these moves are going to be tough. They're going to be tough. But all we can do is wait and see. The die has been cast, and all you can do is root for the kid. And I'm rooting for the kid. He's a really cool story. He's fun. He's fun to talk to. He's really enjoyable. He hopefully the security at the Superdome can remember who he is, so they stop harassing him while he's warming up in pregame. But yeah. So Marco Hernandez says, awesome shot of the New Orleans Saints pennant in the back. We got a lot going on back there. You got the Dome Patrol. You got Drew Brees. That's from his record-setting game. You got the Michael Thomas Funko Pop. It's a whole thing. You got a Pulitzer Prize. That's mine. But anyway, yeah. Thank you for that. Let's go down. There was one in here that I actually thought was a really good point that I didn't get to in the Roby conversation. Don C. Roby's contract was an issue. This frees up money for a veteran offensive lineman. Now, I agree with this. And I also think to an extent, that's why you moved on from the veteran specialists. And I don't think you made the decision. Like, if you felt like Will Lutz was significantly better than Blake Grupe, if you felt like Blake Gillikin was significantly better than Lou Hedley, you wouldn't be making that decision based on money, right? Like, if you felt like it was a significant step back, then that money doesn't matter. What's more important is making the kicks. If you felt like they were even, right? If you felt like there was no real tangible difference, and for one guy you are paying this much, and for one guy you're paying this much, and for that guy that you're paying, you can also ship him out and get a draft pick back, I think that makes the choice for you. And so between Bradley Roby, Blake Gillikin, and Will Lutz, you have saved a not insignificant amount of cash. I don't have the exact numbers on me. I don't want to get them wrong, so I'm not going to try to spew them out to you. But, as you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, what veterans are out there that we might be able to entice, particularly on the offensive line, that's not nothing. And so I agree with you. I think one of the reasons you cut Bradley, one of the reasons you cut Blake, one of the reasons you cut Will was because you now have freed up additional cap space so you can go do something. And I think you got to do something on the offensive line. I mean, you brought in Trey Turner. Like, they already had that idea that they were going to try to bulk up the offensive line depth, right? And it worked until it didn't. You got Trey to come here, but you were not able to get Trey on the field because his quad blew up on him. So I think that is still in the equation. We've all seen that second string offensive line go to work, and it was not pretty in any of the preseason games. So what I will say is they didn't commit any penalties in the last game. So at least that's that. All right, let's see. Bearded Dragon. Are you a real bearded dragon? The DB room isn't my concern. The OL is what I'm concerned about. Yeah, we just got into that. I agree. Alvin Johnson. They are really high on Lonnie Johnson Jr. He's 6'2". I'm really high on Lonnie Johnson Jr. I feel like I've been the captain of the Lonnie Johnson Jr. fan club because I'm the only one that's been talking about him all offseason. Everyone's kind of just ignored him. But I think it's because he's just been solid. Like, he hasn't made any mistakes. He's just been in the right place at the right time. But I will tell you, there was a point in camp that I just asked Dennis Allen, I was like, it seems like we're not really talking about him a lot, but is Lonnie Johnson Jr. a guy that, you guys feel like can get the job done at both safety, cornerback, that versatility? And his eyes lit up. Like, he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question, because I think that the coaching staff really likes Lonnie Johnson Jr. I think they really like Ugo Amadi, and I think those guys were locked into roster spots. We can talk about the competition all we want. Those guys won those spots early and never gave them up. And No, I think you're right. They were really high on Lonnie Johnson. Let's see. I think so. We got a lot of people saying Traquan shouldn't have made the roster. I think there's one saying Kirkwood should have been kept over Smith. He was. Kirkwood did make the roster. I think you had some depth there that you could have gone and kept a Shaq Davis. I'm kind of bummed that you didn't, but I understand it, especially if you end up putting Traquan on IR, because that'll free up a roster spot. I think there's a chance that with Landon Young and Traquan going on IR, which I don't know if they will, but just go with me, then you could add Jalen Smith and Storm Norton probably, or a right tackle to be named later. That's my read on it. But Keith Kirkwood did make this team, and that's good because I think he deserved to make this team. He also, Bearded Dragon also says, I think it's a good roster overall and should definitely win the South. I agree with that. Scott Fontenette says playoff or bust for this team. I don't even bust is the right word. I think it's a playoff or you're all fired. I mean, like you can't. It's tough to say, but I just don't see a scenario where you go into this team and you kind of have gone all in with the quarterback, with the coaching staff, with everything, and you look around the NFC South and it's never been more winnable. And I know every team in the NFC South is saying that, but the Saints are the only team that feels like they are ready right now to win it, and not doing that this year. If you can't win this year, when are you going to win? The only thing that might save this staff if they win 9 games, and maybe Atlanta has this crazy good year and wins 10 games and wins the South. Maybe the only thing that would save the coaching staff probably is the fact that you paid Derek Carr and you wouldn't bring in a new coach with a 37-year-old quarterback, or sorry, a 34-year-old quarterback, however old he is, and then be like, well, figure it out. No, that might save him if they are middling, and you can be like, well, maybe one more year. But yeah, no, you got to win with this team. If you fall flat with this team, then and I'm a pump the brakes guy typically when it comes to fire everybody. No. If you win 8 games or fewer with the setup you have, with the easiest schedule in the NFL, just wipe the slate clean, because it's not working, at least on offense. All right. Couple more here. Marco Hernandez says, are you surprised Pete made the roster? I assume you're talking about Pete. It says Pear, but I think you're talking about Pete. I'm shocked and disappointed at Pete making the roster. I disagree with that. I mean, I think Pete makes the roster as long as Pete is willing to accept a backup role to James Hurst. If he wasn't, if he was a malcontent and it was going to be a problem, then yes, I would say you should cut Pete. But if he's willing to be a backup guard, I mean, I have no issue with that. I think you are in much better shape with Pete than you would be with anyone off the street. I mean, he is a starting caliber guard. He's not the greatest in the world, but he is a starting caliber guard, and that's about as good as you could hope for. Like, if you're signing someone to be a guard and back up James Hurst, I don't think you're going to find anyone better. If you're going to go draft somebody, like, I think Nick Saldiveri is a guy who I'd like to see develop, but no, I have no issue with him making the roster. Now, if you were just pigeonholing him in as the starter, I would have an issue with that, because I think James Hurst has been more consistent. He's available and he's worked with Trevor Penning, and so that's what I want to see. Don C again says, Lonnie is long and covers lots of ground. I think he'll be a contributor given the chance. I agree with you. Toshia Smith, is there a chance we get Nico Lalos back? I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure if you're asking whether they'll bring him back to the active roster or practice squad. I think that they will try to sign him to the practice squad. I talked to his agent. He says he's a likely candidate for the practice squad, and so I don't see why they wouldn't. I'm not sure if he's a vested veteran. Let me look. Because the only question I have, and I should have looked this up beforehand, is, oh no, he is not a vested veteran. So yeah, he has to go through waivers. So if another team claims him, then the Saints can't get him back. And so that's a question. And, I talked about Lucas Kroll probably being the top candidate. Nico's probably the second highest candidate in terms of, when you get 3 sacks in a single quarter of a game, people are going to take notice of that might not have been paying attention. And if there's a team that had a bunch of injuries at defensive tackle and suddenly has roster spots and they don't feel comfortable with their room, yes, there's a chance. But I would guess that he doesn't, because again, waiver claims are not as common as people seem to think they are. I think you're going to get him. Okay, Michael Douglas. This will be the last one we can close on this. How about Jalen Smith? How about Jalen Smith? I like Jalen Smith. I think that he can do some very unique things as a big, strong, downhill linebacker. Now, I don't love him in coverage, and I think he is your Sam linebacker. Now, I think Zach Bond is also your Sam linebacker. So he becomes a little extraneous if you're not going to get them both on the field. And so, I think with a guy like that, and we talked about being a vested veteran, right? If you have 4 years of accrued time in the NFL, you don't have to go through the waiver process. So he is one of those players. Storm Norton is one of those players, right? So one of the reasons that you could potentially say, but even before they say we're waiving you, they say, hey, Jalen, come in here. Okay, don't go anywhere. We're going to cut you, but stick around because when we clear a roster spot, you're going to bring you back. Now, I don't know if that's what's happening, but when we asked Dennis Allen about it today, he said if there was a chance he comes back, he said there's definitely a chance. And so I think that's most likely what ends up happening for Jalen. That said, he is a guy that I think I don't know how you get him on the field as often as you want to, because you're not taking DeMario off the field. You're not taking Pete Werner off the field. So are you really keeping him around just to back up those guys? Or would it make more sense to put him on the practice squad? Will he accept a spot on the practice squad? He did with the Giants last year, and then they ended up beating him. They signed him to the active roster. He played in 13 games. So, maybe that's what happens. Either way, I expect Jalen Smith to be a factor, to be a piece in this defense at some point this season. Whether that's week 1, I don't know. But I think that you'll bring Jalen Smith back. Oh, Randall, you're such a bummer. Okay, we have one more question. So who comes in for Michael Thomas if or when he goes down? That's a good question. I feel like it's tough. I'd probably Keith Kirkwood. I think Keith would be the guy who's been working at the X primarily, and that's what you're talking about when you say, okay, Mike Thomas went down. Okay, who is your X receiver? Because Chris Olave is your Z. Rashid's been working more in the slot, so I imagine he will be that guy. Probably Kirkwood. And then that would, if Mike did go down, right, and you had to put him on IR, then I think you probably would bring up a Shaq Davis, and you would try to start working in A.T. Perry. But that's not a bridge that I'm willing to walk across until it is built. So we will have that. But all right, I'm going to wrap this episode of Inside Black and Gold up right there. This was a special edition to break down the 53-man roster. We're there. We are a week and a half away from week 1. I'm going to enjoy a few days off this weekend and just kind of get reset for the season. But I am pumped. You got the Titans in week 1 coming to the Superdome, and I am thrilled about it. Tajay Spears is going to make everyone mad that the Saints didn't draft him, but we'll talk about that at a later time. Thanks, y'all, for listening. I'm Jeff Nowak. You can follow me on Twitter at Jeff_Nowak. You can follow the latest Saints content. You can check out my 53-man roster breakdown over at WWL.com. Who dat? Go Saints. Be easy, y'all. Peace.